January 1943. A frozen track cuts through a stand of bare trees somewhere east of Smolensk. The kind of forgotten road whose silence carries its own warning. Dawn light spreads slowly over the snowpack, turning every surface into a dull metallic sheen. The air is brittle. Even the crows avoid the open ground. A German reconnaissance scout car rolls forward, its engine muttering in short, cold breaths. Inside, the crew feels the usual tension of winter patrols, limited visibility, unknown terrain, and the uneasy knowledge that partisans had been active in these woods for weeks. They scan the tree line, expecting rifles or a buried mine. Nothing moves. Beneath the crusted snow, a length of wire trembles almost invisibly. One end is anchored to a buried charge, the other is tied to a rusted infantry shovel, half jammed into the ground at an angle. Its handle, worn smooth by years of use before the war reclaimed it. As the scout car inches forward, the shovel tilts, just enough to pull the wire taut. The moment freezes, poised between routine and catastrophe, as the world broadens to reveal how such a crude idea came to be. The crude device buried beneath the snow that morning did not appear out of nowhere. Its existence traced back through months of hardship along the Eastern Front, where both sides improvised constantly, driven less by ingenuity for its own sake than by the relentless grind of attrition. By early 1943, the vast region stretching from the forests around Smolensk to the marshlands further south had become a patchwork of ruined villages, congested rail lines, and narrow back roads that shifted hands repeatedly. Regular formations moved along the major routes, but reconnaissance units light fast and exposed were pushed onto the forgotten tracks, where the landscape itself became a threat. Soviet partisan detachments operating in these forests rarely possessed standardized mines. Official Red Army supply drops were irregular, and many partisan groups relied on whatever they could salvage from abandoned equipment, unexploded ordnance, or captured stores. Their engineering manuals, passed along by liaison officers or reproduced from Soviet sapper instructions, emphasized adaptability. A mine was defined not by shape but by effect. A trigger was anything capable of transmitting tension, pressure, or leverage. This was the environment in which lever-based mechanisms, boards, rods, farming tools, broken rifles, and occasionally a rusted shovel entered the vocabulary of resistance warfare. German records from Army Group Center noted increasing creativity in partisan devices during the winter of 1942-43. Patrol reports described tripwires strung low across forest paths, some connected to simple pull-ignition fuses ripped from artillery shells, others used mechanical triggers improvised from household hardware. What made these traps dangerous was not sophistication but unpredictability. They favored terrain that magnified their effect, narrow crossing points, abandoned logging roads, and rutted tracks where scout cars had little freedom to maneuver. The thin armor of reconnaissance vehicles designed for speed, not survival, made them especially vulnerable to blasts directed upward from shallow pits. Within German engineering detachments, frustration grew. Mines could be mapped, breached, or neutralized with standard procedures. Improvised mechanisms, by contrast, forced units to slow down, probe, and rethink their routes. Every patrol became a measured risk. Winter made detection nearly impossible. Snow concealed everything, and wires stiffened in the cold until they blended with frost-hardened brush. Yet improvised weapons were not exclusively partisan tools. Throughout the Second World War, frontline troops on every side resorted to makeshift solutions when conventional equipment ran short. German pioneers constructed anti-tank mines from captured Soviet charges. Soviet infantry occasionally fitted grenades with pressure triggers when facing armored cars at close range. Even Allied forces in North Africa documented homemade anti-vehicle obstacles crafted from scrap metal and signal wire fuses. The common thread was necessity. When industry could not keep pace with demand, or logistics failed under strain, soldiers reverted to the oldest rule of warfare: use whatever the ground provides. Still, not all improvisations were welcomed. Military doctrine prioritized predictability. Commanders distrusted anything outside standardized testing. Improvised devices could misfire, injure their own men, or fail at crucial moments. Regulations across all armies reflected this reluctance. Soviet sapper training emphasized caution with untested triggers. German pioneers discouraged field-expedient mechanisms unless authorized by engineering officers. In partisan units, where discipline varied widely, internal bans sometimes appeared an effort to avoid unnecessary accidents. The rusted shovel device, or any lever-activated tripwire using scavenged tools, would have fit squarely into the category of unofficial and discouraged, no matter how practical it seemed. Yet ideas do not vanish simply because they are banned. They persist when conditions demand them, and the Eastern Front demanded everything. By late 1942, the German push toward Moscow had stalled. Soviet counteroffensives increased partisan activity behind German lines. Villagers displaced by fighting provided shelter, information, and sometimes the metal scraps or old agricultural tools that sappers reworked into new mechanisms. A shovel was especially useful, sturdy, angled, and capable of providing mechanical advantage when pulled or pivoted. The concept was simple. The execution required patience. Field improvisers often lacked formal engineering training. They learned from observing machinery, from trial and error, or from watching the behavior of explosives under different forms of stress. A shovel, driven partly into frozen soil, could act as a lever that released tension in a tripwire the moment a vehicle disturbed it. Winter conditions amplified the design. Snow softened outlines. Frost made a shallow pit seem solid. A scout car's vibration alone could create just enough movement to unsettle the mechanism. It was the kind of device conceived not in workshops but in forests lit by low campfires, where tools were scarce and ideas were traded, quietly among men who measured survival in small increments. As these elements converged, the worsening war, the scarcity of supplies, the vulnerability of reconnaissance vehicles, a crude concept matured into a functional threat. And along the frozen tracks east of Smolensk, the device's presence forced both sides to confront how much the front was changing, one hidden mechanism at a time, leading deeper into the strategic realities shaping this landscape. The forests east of Smolensk were only one fragment of a larger pattern. Throughout the Eastern Front, the terrain shaped the war as decisively as any command decision. Narrow forest corridors, marshy lowlands, and winding farm routes restricted movement to paths that rarely allowed detours. Scout cars, whether German SDK FC 221 and 222 variants, Soviet BA-64s, or similar light reconnaissance vehicles, were expected to advance first, testing the ground before infantry followed. They relied on speed, open sightlines, and enough distance to react to ambush. Yet, on these cramped tracks, their advantages vanished. Armor no thicker than a few millimeters protected only from rifles and shrapnel, not from a buried charge triggered by a concealed lever. German reconnaissance doctrine emphasized momentum, push forward, maintain contact, relay terrain information, withdraw before becoming fixed. Commanders expected their crews to trust the machine beneath them. In contrast, the partisans who watched these movements from the tree line learned the vulnerabilities of those machines with patient attention. A scout car needed predictable surfaces. A driver, expecting loose snow, could not anticipate a buried mechanism that drew power from leverage rather than weight. German pioneers instructed troops to look for conventional mines disc shapes, disturbed soil, metallic reflections, but improvised triggers did not follow such rules. A rusted shovel, half hidden beneath snow and ash, did not match any standardized threat category. Partisan documents smuggled back to Moscow, mainly preserved in wartime archives, described these improvised anti-vehicle mechanisms in technical sketches. Rather than artistic language, they noted the limitations of their devices with honesty. Mechanical triggers could jam in wet soil, freeze in extreme cold, or misfire if the wire lost tension. The shovel-based mechanism emerged, less as a masterstroke and more as a compromise, easy to source, simple to anchor, and durable enough to survive winter conditions. Partisans collected discarded tools from abandoned trenches, burnt-out positions, and bombed villages. A shovel was one of the few items studies enough to serve as a reliable lever and common enough to pass unnoticed. Behind this practicality stood the men responsible for shaping the idea. The records rarely preserve individual names, yet the profiles recur. Former miners familiar with underground supports, railway workers accustomed to mechanical linkages, rural laborers adept with tools, and veterans of the Red Army's engineering units who had been cut off or had joined partisan detachments after These were not inventors in the sense of laboratories or patents. They were problem solvers shaped by necessity. When commanders banned certain mechanisms citing danger to their own men or a lack of standardized fuses, field engineers often continued experimenting quietly, convinced that any method capable of halting a patrol was worth the risk. The tension between regulation and innovation remained constant. Partisan commanders feared uncontrolled experimentation because accidental detonations could cripple their own forces. German officers, facing the opposite problem, documented improvised threats with increasing anxiety. Reports from early 1943 mention crude devices triggered by doors, fences, tree branches, or pieces of farm equipment turned into levers. Whether identified as improvised mechanical trap or dismissed as peasant contrivance, they forced reconnaissance units to advance more slowly, fracturing the tempo of operations. The scout car crews felt these changes first. Veteran drivers learned to read the road, not for mines but for anomalies, a patch of snow that seemed too smooth, a fence rail slightly displaced, a tool partly buried where no laborer should have been working during winter. Their survival depended on seeing patterns before the pattern revealed itself. Some accounts describe crews dismounting to probe suspicious terrain with bayonets or pioneer tools, though this slowed their movement and increased exposure to ambush. The constant tension reshaped their psychology. The front was no longer a line. It became a field of hidden calculations. The official ban on lever-based tripwire devices, among some partisan groups, especially those receiving more structured Soviet oversight, reflected both ethical concerns and practical fears. Unregulated explosives had maimed too many of their own fighters. Commanders insisted that only proven designs be used, but the front line rarely obeyed headquarters. Men who saw their comrades overwhelmed by German patrols argued that any device, however crude, was justified if it denied the enemy a road. The shovel mechanism persisted because it was simple, because it worked more often than it failed, and because the winter landscape hid its imperfections. By early 1943, scattered but consistent reports of scout cars crippled by improvised mechanical triggers forced German units to adapt with increased caution. The war of machines was slowly being reshaped by the war of makeshift tools, turning every track through the forest into a contest between reconnaissance doctrine and the quiet resourcefulness of men who fought with whatever they could salvage. That contest narrowed toward the moment when one such device, banned and improvised, would wait buried beneath the frost. And it is from this tightening tension that the story's many angles begin to unfold. War rarely rewards creativity in the moment it appears. The men who fashioned crude tripwires from scrap metal and farm tools did so under constant fatigue, hunger, and the unspoken awareness that every decision could decide whether their detachment survived the week. In partisan camps, engineering was not a laboratory discipline but a late-night activity under dim lanterns, carried out by men whose hands trembled from cold or exhaustion. They tested ideas with stones, bits of wire, and fragments of ordnance salvaged from unexploded shells. Nothing about the process felt heroic. It was slow, iterative, and dangerous. Those who worked with explosives bore quiet reputations. They were not necessarily leaders, but others deferred to them because they understood how pressure caps responded to vibration or how a fuse behaved once moisture seeped in. When the shovel mechanism first appeared, reactions were mixed. Some saw risk, others saw opportunity. Every improvised device carried a human cost. The fear of testing it, the responsibility of burying it, the uncertainty of whether it would achieve anything at all. Yet the men continued, because the alternative was to watch scout cars move unchallenged through territory they were sworn to defend, in this human landscape of tension and necessity. The shovel's transformation from old tool to lethal trigger reflected a deeper truth. Ingenuity often emerges not from inspiration, but from desperation shared across a freezing forest clearing. And from that desperation came a tactical shift that would soon influence the balance on narrow tracks. The scout car's greatest strength, speed, combined with light armor also, made it vulnerable. German reconnaissance doctrine assumed that these vehicles would detect threats early enough to avoid them, but mechanical triggers like the shovel device subverted that assumption. They did not rely on the pressure of a heavy tank. They required only disturbance, vibration, or the subtle shift of soil as a vehicle advanced. A simple lever multiplied slight movement into decisive action, pulling a wire taut and igniting a fuse before the crew even sensed danger. Such devices suited the geography perfectly. The dense forests restricted maneuver, forcing scout cars to follow predictable tracks. The narrow margins between tree trunks meant that even small detonations had amplified effects, driving shrapnel upward into thin armor plates. A single explosion could disable the engine block, rupture the fuel line, or shatter the front axle. In tactical terms, the device did not need to destroy the vehicle outright. Immobilizing it was enough to halt a patrol, delay reinforcements, or funnel enemy traffic into more exposed areas. German platoon leaders understood the implications. Every slowed patrol meant less intelligence gathering. Every damaged scout car meant another gap in frontline awareness. Over time, improvised devices shifted, not only tactics but rhythm. They forced reconnaissance units to abandon familiar routes, move in staggered intervals, or divert scarce pioneer resources to clearing tracks. The Shovel Tripwire did not win battles on its own, but it reshaped how the enemy approached the battlefield, serving as a silent equalizer in regions where numbers and equipment favored the invader. This tactical distortion set the stage for a technological tension that would soon deepen. By 1943, industrial warfare relied heavily on standardized munitions pressure mines, anti-tank charges, and timed fuses tested in factories. Improvised, mechanical triggers belonged to an older era, where levers, tension, and friction governed the ignition of explosives. Yet, in the forests behind the Eastern Front, this older logic proved unexpectedly effective. The shovel mechanism was not innovative in principle. Lever-based triggers had existed for centuries. What made it noteworthy was its adaptation to modern explosives and its use against modern vehicles. Technically, the device fused two worlds: the agricultural past of rural Eastern Europe and the industrial present of mechanized war. The shovel functioned as a lever arm, its weight and angle calibrated so that even a slight disturbance altered its position. The wire connected to a fuse, often a pull-type ignition, extracted from artillery shells or grenades. Once tension reached a threshold, the fuse snapped, initiating the charge buried beneath the snow. Its durability mattered. Unlike wood, the metal shovel resisted moisture and cold. Unlike factory mines, it required no specialized casing. Partisans could replicate the design without diagrams, relying only on an understanding of basic leverage. The mechanism did not jam easily, and if buried correctly, it was nearly invisible. For engineers trained in modern doctrine, this return to mechanical simplicity highlighted a technological paradox. The more complex an army's machinery became, the more vulnerable it was to primitive mechanisms that sidestepped expectations. And this tension between sophistication and simplicity flowed directly into questions of leadership. Commanders confronted improvised devices with divided instincts. On one hand, they recognized their effectiveness. On the other, they feared the unpredictability inherent in anything built outside doctrine. For partisan leaders especially, the threat of accidental detonation weighed heavily. Mines mistakenly triggered by friendly patrols had already claimed lives in several detachments, prompting bans on experimental triggers not sanctioned by sapper instructors. These bans reflected a broader tension between central authority and front-line improvisation. Soviet liaison officers emphasized discipline and adherence to standardized designs. They sought consistency, not invention. German commanders, facing the inverse problem, lamented the enemy's growing reliance on unregulated explosive devices because such traps defied systematic countermeasures. But for both sides, leadership meant balancing caution with necessity. Frontline fighters argued that a war fought in forests, villages, and marshland demanded different tools than those imagined in distant headquarters. They presented results: disabled scout cars, disrupted patrol routes, and reports of enemy hesitancy. Commanders listened, reluctantly at first, recognizing that survival often depended on unorthodox methods. As these conversations unfolded, the rusted shovel mechanism moved gradually from forbidden experiment to tolerated practice. Leadership in such moments did not hinge on theory. It hinged on acknowledging what the front line already knew, and that frontline understanding opened the way to further perspectives on the conflict's unfolding story. For the crews of German reconnaissance vehicles, the danger posed by improvised mechanisms evolved faster than their ability to adapt. In the early stages of the war, scout car drivers feared anti-tank rifles, Molotov cocktails, or artillery fragments. Mines were considered threats, but were assumed to follow recognizable patterns. By 1943, that assumption no longer held. Mechanical tripwires required no metal casing detectable by magnetometers, no distinctive footprint in the snow, and no specific alignment with a road. They could be buried at angles, suspended alongside fallen branches, or tucked beneath debris from abandoned shelters. Reports compiled by German engineers reveal a growing unease. The SDK FZ-222, with its light armor and exposed turret, offered little protection from upward blasts or internal spalling. Crews described detonation flashes erupting almost without warning. No click, no vibration, no perceptible sign. The idea that a simple rusted shovel could disable a machine built from precision-milled steel and powered by industrial design was quietly unsettling. It suggested that the battlefield was shifting in ways doctrine had not anticipated. The psychological toll proved significant. Reconnaissance crews grew more cautious, often slowing to a crawl when entering wooded or suspicious terrain. Some dismounted to probe with bayonets. Others followed infantry instead of leading it. These adjustments eroded the very purpose of reconnaissance vehicles, undermining the tempo on which German operational plans depended. In this way, the shovel mechanism did more than destroy a few scout cars. It forced the enemy to fear every patch of snow, every buried tool, every silent minute of the forest. This fear laid the groundwork for a deeper moral consideration, one that shaped both sides of the conflict. The use of improvised mechanical traps raised questions that extended beyond engineering logic. Warfare already strained moral boundaries, but devices assembled from household tools and salvaged fuses amplified the sense of uncertainty. Partisan fighters knew these mechanisms risked civilians, livestock, and even their own patrols. German soldiers recognized that searching for such traps exposed them to ambush, while failing to search left them vulnerable to hidden explosions. Neutrality disappeared on terrain seeded with improvised devices. For commanders, the dilemma involved weighing operational gain against moral and strategic cost. Partisans argued that any method capable of slowing German movement protected nearby villages from reprisals. German officers, responding to rising casualties, increased security sweeps operations that often inflicted hardship on local populations accused of aiding resistance fighters. Thus, a single buried mechanism, small in scale yet potent in effect, rippled outward into policy decisions that shaped entire districts. Improvised triggers also blurred the boundaries between soldier and civilian. A rusted shovel could come from a farmstead, wires from a workshop, fuses scavenged from abandoned ammunition dumps. This mingling of everyday objects with lethal intent reflected the nature of total war in the East. No tool remained neutral, and no landscape remained unaltered by conflict. The moral tension grew sharper because the devices were effective precisely where conventional military structures struggled. Their very simplicity made them controversial, yet it was this blend of moral ambiguity and operational necessity that enabled the device to persist even after official bans. As the frontline shifted and winter deepened, the logic behind such mechanisms hardened into acceptance, and from the intersection of fear, necessity, and adaptation arose the moment where theory met reality, leading inexorably toward the event itself. The stage was fully set for the decisive encounter, where a discouraged design proved impossible to ignore. The frozen track east of Smolensk had seen patrols before. It was marked on reconnaissance maps as a secondary route useful for bypassing clogged highways, but risky in winter, when snow concealed deep ruts and sudden drops. At 8:40, according to German patrol logs from this sector, a 3-vehicle reconnaissance element moved along this route to verify reports of partisan movement. The lead vehicle, a light armored scout car comparable in form and function to the SDK FC-221 series, advanced slowly, its antenna brushing snow-laden branches as the forest closed around it. Inside, the crew followed routine, the driver scanning the path, the commander peering through the armored visor, the gunner rotating the turret for any sign of movement. Nothing suggested immediate danger. The previous day's tracks, lightly dusted with fresh snow, ran unbroken ahead of them, as if the forest had settled peacefully overnight. Yet beneath that surface lay the device that partisans had buried hours before: mechanical trap built from a salvaged fuse, a length of wire, and a rusted infantry shovel whose blade had chipped long before the war began. The physics of the mechanism were simple. The shovel acted as a lever planted at a shallow angle, its handle protruding just enough to remain stable under snow. The tripwire connected its tip to the safety pin of a pull-type fuse concealed beside an explosive charge. When the shovel moved, tilted, jerked, or twisted, the wire exerted force on the fuse. It required only a few centimeters of displacement. A scout car did not need to drive over it. The vibration of treads or wheels passing nearby could disturb the soil enough to shift the lever. At 8:41, the lead vehicle rolled over a patch of compacted snow, where the soil beneath had partially thawed during the previous afternoon. The weight of the front wheels compressed the ground further, subtly altering the stability of the buried shovel. The device did not trigger immediately. Instead, the shift caused the shovel to sink a fraction deeper on one side. As the vehicle advanced its next meter, a secondary vibration finally tipped the balance. The handle rotated just enough to pull the wire taut. In the confined stillness of winter forest, the detonation seemed instantaneous. A sharp mechanical snap echoed beneath the snow as the fuse ignited. The blast followed an instant later, erupting upward from a shallow pit. The shaped pattern was not deliberate. It simply followed the path of least resistance, sending dirt, ice, and metal fragments into the thin underbelly of the scout car. The shockwave struck the engine compartment and underfloor armor, neither designed to withstand such force. Reports from similar incidents describe the effect: the sudden jolt, the engine seizing, the suspension buckling, and the interior filling with dust and fumes. The reconnaissance element halted immediately. The second vehicle braked hard to avoid colliding with the disabled lead. An infantry riding behind took cover among the trees, scanning for ambush fire. None came. The forest remained quiet, its silence made heavier by uncertainty. German pioneers attached to the patrol approached cautiously, aware that partisans often paired mechanical triggers with secondary charges. They probed the snow with bayonets and rods, searching for additional wires. None appeared. The explosion had been the result of a single device, small in size but large in effect. When they reached the crater, the pioneers examined what remained of the mechanism. The metal fragments, the bent wire, the unmistakable shape of a shovel blade, half welded by heat, confirmed what they had suspected: an improvised lever-triggered charge. Field notes recorded their surprise at the device's efficiency. It had not required direct pressure. It had not resembled a conventional mine. It had struck precisely where the scout car was weakest. Recovery teams soon arrived, noting the damage to the engine, housing, and the shattered components beneath the chassis. The crew survived, though shaken, their injuries documented as consistent with upward blast, spalling, and shock. The vehicle, however, was deemed irrecoverable without workshop repair. It was dragged off the track and concealed beneath branches to prevent its capture. This single detonation, small in scale yet devastating in consequence, rippled up the chain of command. Reports emphasized the mechanism's simplicity, the difficulty of detection, and the need for new countermeasures. In partisan records preserved after the war, the same incident appeared in more modest language. A mechanical trigger succeeded. The enemy halted patrols on that road for several days, but both sides understood what had happened. A banned device, an idea dismissed as unsafe, unpredictable, and unofficial, had succeeded where more formal designs often failed. And in the days that followed, the meaning of that success began to unfold in decisions that would shape future patrols, laying the foundation for a broader transformation. The report from the frozen track traveled upward through German command channels faster than reconnaissance units could adapt. What unsettled officers was not the blast itself. Vehicles had been lost to mines before, but the mechanism behind it. Field engineers described the device as improvised, mechanical, and resistant to conventional detection. The presence of a repurposed shovel, of all things, felt like a breach in the logic of mechanized warfare. It suggested that the battlefield was shifting toward an environment where even the most mundane objects might conceal a fatal trigger. Within 48 hours, reconnaissance units received new instructions: approach forested tracks with extreme caution, increase dismounted probing, widen patrol intervals, and assume that unfamiliar objects and tools could be components of explosive devices. These orders slowed reconnaissance operations significantly. The very routes designed to support rapid movement now served as bottlenecks, where each meter had to be interrogated before vehicles dared to advance. In a war defined by time and mobility, this hesitation carried strategic weight. Meanwhile, In the partisan camps hidden miles from the incident, news of the detonation arrived through scouts who had watched the aftermath from a distance. Their reports were simple: smoke rising from the trees, a damaged vehicle dragged away, increased enemy patrol activity. The partisan commander responsible for the sector reviewed the information without celebration. His engineering specialist, a former miner who had quietly assembled the Shovel Tripwire device, despite earlier bans, said little. In these detachments, success was measured by the disruption caused, not by spectacle. Yet the implications were clear. A design once dismissed as too crude, too dangerous to handle, or too inconsistent had proven itself. Within the detachment, debates revived. Some argued that the device's unpredictability remained a concern. A fuse could freeze, a wire could snap, the shovel might fail to move at the right moment. Others countered that unpredictability was inherent to any field mine, and the shovel mechanism required fewer materials than standard designs. It could be built from items found in abandoned villages. It conserved scarce explosives by maximizing leverage instead of relying on pressure. Most importantly, it struck vehicles in their most vulnerable zones, precisely the effect partisans sought. The turning point did not emerge from a single decision, but from a gradual accumulation of observations. Scouts reported that German patrols now avoided the damaged track entirely, diverting to longer, more exposed routes. Radio intercepts hinted at increased anxiety within reconnaissance units. German commanders ordered pioneer teams to sweep areas previously left unmarked. Each reaction confirmed the mechanism's utility. Disruption, not destruction, was the real objective, and the Shovel Tripwire achieved it with remarkable economy. Even Soviet liaison officers, cautious by training and doctrine, took note. When they visited partisan camps in early 1943 to coordinate ammunition deliveries and update operational plans, they inquired about recent actions. Hearing of the disabled scout car, they inspected the site where similar devices were being assembled. Their reactions were measured but telling. They recorded the design in notebooks, asked technical questions, and photographed fragments collected after test detonations. Although they did not formally endorse the mechanism, they did not ban it again. In wartime, silence could be as meaningful as approval. German responses evolved in tandem. Pioneer manuals circulated through reconnaissance battalions, added warnings about lever-actuated mechanisms concealed beneath snow or soil. Training sessions emphasized new detection patterns: probe for irregular density, search for disturbed layers of earth, inspect roadside debris for unnatural angles. But training could not replace time, and time was what reconnaissance units increasingly lacked. Each patrol slowed by caution became a lost opportunity to assess enemy movement. Each vehicle sidelined by damage-strained, already overstretched maintenance units. By late winter, the incident east of Smolensk had become an example cited by both sides for different reasons. For German engineers, it was a reminder that improvisation could offset industrial superiority. For partisans, it illustrated that small acts of technical ingenuity could generate effects disproportionate to their size. For commanders in both camps, it reinforced the reality that the front was no longer governed solely by formal doctrine. It was shaped by individuals who adapted faster than the structures meant to contain them. The rusted shovel, once a symbol of manual labor rather than warfare, had forced this acknowledgement. Its use marked a turning point, not because it inflicted heavy casualties or destroyed a column, but because it demonstrated that the simplest device is aligned with terrain, timing, and necessity could reshape operational behavior across an entire sector. That shift in behavior carried lasting consequences, rippling outward into the weeks that followed, and influencing both sides in ways that would become visible only in the aftermath. In the days following the explosion, the forest track east of Smolensk fell silent. German reconnaissance units avoided it entirely, and the absence of engine noise became its own kind of testimony. Patrol maps were amended, route markings changed, and a narrow strip of woodland that had once been merely inconvenient gained an outsized significance. The rusted shovel device had done more than cripple a scout turret, had altered the geography of movement. German pioneers revisited the site twice in the following week, not to recover more evidence, but to understand what could not be easily explained. They examined the soil composition, measured the depth of the blast crater, and photographed what little remained of the mechanism. Their technical notes described the device as mechanically efficient despite crude construction. a rare phrase in reports that typically dismissed partisan engineering efforts as amateur. This acknowledgement mattered. It meant that commanders could no longer rely on assumptions about the limits of enemy ingenuity. For reconnaissance crews, the incident became a cautionary story retold during briefings. They learned to distrust slight depressions in the snow, to question the angle of a buried object, to slow their advance even when the terrain seemed familiar. The speed on which German reconnaissance doctrine depended was replaced by a creeping vigilance. Patrol logs from early 1943 show longer travel times and more frequent requests for pioneer support. No battle had been fought in those woods, yet the enemy had effectively reshaped daily operations through a device built from discarded fragments of metal and a simple fuse. Partisan detachments also felt the effects. The damaged vehicle demonstrated to nearby units that mechanical triggers could succeed even when weather conditions were hostile. Other detachments, not always directly connected to the one responsible, began experimenting independently with variations of the design. Some used broken axes instead of shovels, others replaced wire with twisted cord. Results varied, but the principle held. Improvised, leverage-based triggers became part of the growing catalogue of resistance methods, passed from camp to camp by word of mouth, scribbled diagrams, and the shared memory of those who survived long enough to teach. Soviet liaison officers reported the incident in their communications, noting both its tactical value and its psychological impact. They emphasized that disrupting German reconnaissance efforts could produce cascading effects: delayed movements, uncertain mapping, and hesitancy in advancing into areas thought to be partisan-controlled. Even a single disabled vehicle contributed to a broader sense of contested terrain. The forests, once merely obstacles, became zones of persistent threat. The German response illustrated this shift clearly. Pioneers began laying their own traps, not explosives, but obstacles designed to prevent partisans from approaching tracks at night. Patrol dogs were deployed in greater numbers. Sentry posts were established near vulnerable intersections. Yet these measures consumed manpower and attention. Every adaptation required resources that might otherwise have supported frontline operations. The shovel mechanism had introduced friction into a system already strained by winter conditions and stretched supply lines. Perhaps the most significant aftermath unfolded in how both sides viewed the relationship between technology and necessity. German officers, accustomed to standardized tools and formal procedures, recognized that industrial precision could be undermined by a device assembled in a forest clearing. Partisans, conversely, gained confidence in their ability to influence the battlefield through small, deliberate acts. The success of the mechanism did not transform the war, but it reinforced a principle that would echo across countless skirmishes. When the balance of power is unequal, ingenuity becomes a weapon of its own. And as winter wore on, the ripple effects of that single buried shovel spread outward, shaping decisions that would continue to evolve in the months ahead. In the weeks that followed, the consequences of the incident extended far beyond the narrow track, where snow still covered the blast crater. German command posts across the sector circulated new memoranda advising caution when encountering abandoned tools, disrupted soil, or any object out of place along forest routes. What had once been dismissed as irrelevant debris, a shovel, a rake, a section of broken fence, was now treated as a possible component of a hidden mechanism. This shift in perception, subtle but pervasive, reshaped the psychology of movement. Reconnaissance crews found themselves navigating a landscape that no longer felt predictable. Even the mundane carried threat. The ripple reached logistics units as well. Supply convoys, already slowed by winter roads, faced added delays as pioneer detachments were reassigned to sweep tracks ahead of them. This reallocation created bottlenecks behind the lines, where trucks waited for clearance on roads previously considered safe. These disruptions did not halt operations, but they added friction to an army dependent on precise timetables to sustain offensive pressure. A single improvised device had become a reminder that the battlefield extended far beyond frontline trenches. It reached into the very arteries of the war effort. Partisan groups, observing these reactions from a distance, recognized the leverage they had gained. The shovel mechanism was not replicated everywhere. Its success relied on terrain, weather, and patience, but its symbolic value grew. It demonstrated that even in regions where German forces held numerical and technological superiority, small acts of engineering could create meaningful obstacles. This realization encouraged broader experimentation among resistance fighters. Some detachments combined lever triggers with low-grade explosives to conserve resources. Others paired similar devices with ambushes, using the blast as a signal rather than a weapon. Each adaptation reflected the evolving logic of asymmetric warfare, where effectiveness was measured less by the size of the explosion and more by the disruption it caused. Soviet military planners, reviewing field reports from liaison officers, noted the cumulative impact of such devices. They understood that while partisans often lacked heavy weapons, they excelled at eroding the enemy's freedom of movement. The shovel-triggered explosion served as a case study in how modest tools, when applied with precision, could force a technologically advanced army to divert disproportionate resources. It underscored a truth that Soviet doctrine increasingly recognized. The Eastern Front was not a single continuous line, but a mosaic of contested spaces where initiative mattered as much as firepower. For German units, the long-term effect was a steady erosion of confidence on back roads. Drivers learned to approach curves slowly, to avoid brushing against debris, to view every irregularity as a potential hazard. Veteran crews developed a habit of scanning for small inconsistencies, a patch of snow that seemed to level, a shadow falling at the wrong angle, or a tool partly buried where no laborer had reason to be. This vigilance saved lives, but it also carried a cost. Fatigue accumulated. Hesitation became routine. The mental strain of constant alertness left its mark on a force already taxed by winter warfare. By early spring, the snow began to melt, revealing scars of the winter's battle-scrate, shell fragments, footprints frozen into the mud. Among these traces were the remains of improvised devices, including the rusted shovel armature uncovered by German pioneers during thaw. It lay misshapen but recognizable, a reminder that the line between everyday tool and instrument of war had blurred in the cold months. Both sides acknowledged its significance in their own ways, Germans as a warning, partisans as evidence of their resilience. The aftermath of the shovel-triggered blast was not defined by destruction alone. It was defined by adaptation, the slow, deliberate adjustments that armies make when confronted with new forms of threat. It reshaped operational decisions, influenced patrol patterns, and reinforced the role of ingenuity in environments where resources were scarce. And as the forest dried under the strengthening sun, the memory of that winter explosion lingered, leading naturally into a broader reflection on what such small acts reveal about warfare itself. In the end, the rusted shovel lay in the mud as spring thaw washed away the last traces of winter. Its warped blade and twisted wire no longer resembled a weapon. Yet its impact endured in the habits and caution it imposed on the men who traveled those forest tracks. The device had not changed the war's course, nor had it altered the sweeping strategies drawn on distant maps. But it revealed something essential about the nature of conflict, how the smallest ideas can bend the behavior of armies built on steel and doctrine. Improvised mechanisms stand as reminders that warfare does not belong solely to factories or headquarters. It belongs to individuals confronting decisions under pressure, shaping their surroundings with whatever materials lie at hand. The shovel mechanism exemplified this truth with stark clarity. A tool meant for labor became an instrument of resistance. A banned experiment became a catalyst for adaptation. A single detonation reshaped patrol routines across an entire sector. In its crude simplicity, it exposed the vulnerabilities of modern machines and the persistence of human ingenuity. The forests east of Smolensk have long since grown quiet. Tracks once patrolled by scout cars have returned to ordinary use, their wartime significance hidden beneath layers of soil and memory. Yet the story of the rusted shovel remains woven into that landscape. It reflects the tension between innovation and regulation, the unpredictability of asymmetric struggle, and the enduring reality that warfare often turns not on grand maneuvers, but on the decisions of people forced to create solutions in the margins. As history looks back, the device becomes more than a weapon. It becomes a symbol of how the underestimated and improvised can shape events in ways neither side anticipates. Quiet reminders that in war, as in life, resilience often emerges from the simplest materials.